It's now time for the highlight of the afternoon, the launch of Peter's Quay. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Eileen Dunn.
A vera a íana speisialta agus a cóide cá an áhas ar an bheith an seo bhór láthair freisin tránóna. Mayor O'Hargon, special guests, ladies and gentlemen, I too am delighted to be here and to be part of this afternoon. I'm not a Deluckery, I'm a Dunn, but I'm no relation, we're just good friends. But we do come from a very similar background, Declan and I. My grandfather too was involved in the War of Independence, though he ended up on the other side of the treaty debate. In fact, like Declan's great-grandfather Richard, my grandfather went from Laois to the States and joined Clonagh and came home then at the behest of Liam Mellows and got involved up around Laois. He too was imprisoned, he tried to escape, and in fact when I was growing up I mixed the two stories. I always thought my grandfather was involved in the De Valera escape, but he was trying to escape from the Curragh, whereas De Valera was trying to get out of Lincoln prison. And there's a photograph in this book of a notebook belonging to Tomás McCurtain. When they were in Reading jail, they all signed, all the Irish inmates signed a notebook, and I have the autograph book that my grandfather had in the Curragh and in D-Wing in Mountjoy with a set of playing cards that they all signed. And there's a name there, Martin Smith from Kilkenny, and we reckon that he was either the husband or the brother of a Miss Smith that was in Common Le Monde that Peter had trouble with when he came home later. So I mean, the links are all over the place, it's just incredible. We were saying, the day that Declan and Wynne brought the book down to me, we were saying, had we only listened to the stories when we were children, but of course we didn't want to know at the time. I have a memory of being driven from Clonaslee to Tullamore by my grandfather in his Hillman Hunter, which had an overdrive gear, not a fifth gear as we know it. There behind the Schneid Blooms, that's where I hid out when I was on the run, and the car is going over on the wrong side of the road. Oh, stop, just get us to Tullamore. Anyway, Declan could have been saved an awful lot of work had he listened to the stories when he was a child, but I know that the last 4 years he has worked on this non-stop. I know that he gives credit to several people, and there are too many of them to list, professional and family and everybody else who helped him with his researches and with what he was going to do. But he had to put it together. He had to weave the narrative, and a wonderful narrative he has woven with it all. I'm just going to quote little bits. Obviously, Peter's background, the foundry and everything made him the ideal person, but just how the whole thing came about. And it took 4 attempts to get them out of there, and a number of keys, and a couple of which broke, etc., etc. But it started when the First World War ended. The prisoners were disappointed that they weren't released and became irritable, which manifested itself in concrete thoughts of escape. Michael J. Lennon was the first one to make Peter seriously consider its feasibility, but Peter rejected several proposals put to him. Finally, Lennon managed to secure a promise from Peter that he would assess the options open to them and choose the best one. After careful consideration, Peter decided that there was only one way of escaping, and that was probably the very easiest way: to open the door and walk out. He noticed that there was a door in the prison wall of the exercise yard. Now this is him. I discovered that all the locks in the prison, with the exception of the cell door lock, were the same. I therefore discovered that to open the locks after they were closed for the night by the governor's representative, one required a master key. The key, usually held by the warder, simply opened the door when it was what I might call half-locked. In the evenings, the governor's representative, on making his inspection, gives the lock bolt a second shot, and when thus locked, the ordinary warder's key wouldn't open it. As I say, it took 4 attempts, and for whatever happened afterwards, and I love the notion that Mr. De Valera went to Peter Deluckery's funeral. I love the picture of the book, in the book, of him holding the key, and apparently his comment on the day was, it turned like velvet in the book. It's a very important, as we come up to 2016, I think this is so important. As the Mayor was talking about from a teaching perspective, I feel the same. My father did up a paper for us on my grandfather's involvement, and when I took it out a couple of weeks ago to compare notes, I said to my son, you have to read this now, this is important, you have to read it in the run-up. I would go a step further in the teaching of history. When I was being taught history 45 years ago, it stopped at a certain point, and we only got so much, and there's so much that we don't have that we have to go back and read again. There's been an awful lot of revisionism. I'm not going to go into that. There are people in this room much better qualified than me. But I do think we have to step back and look again as we come up to 2016 and to realise the sacrifices that these people made, no matter what side they ended up on. The personal sacrifices. That's the beauty of a book like this. It gives us all the history, but in weaving his narrative, Declan is telling us the personal stories as well. The personal cost in terms of family life, in terms of business, in terms of everything else. We have to look at that again and see what these people did. I think this book is going to make a tremendous contribution to the national discussion that's going to take place over the next few years. I commend it to you, and I now declare it officially launched. Thank you.
Thank you, Eileen. I'd now like to ask Wynne Dunn to make a presentation to Maura DeLuca, daughter of Larry and Sheila DeLuca, who is celebrating her birthday today. Happy birthday, Maura. Granddaughters, Pat DeLuca.
Dís Marie Galéir agus beáid ormh éiscint nachfuil cá péis mór fada I lábhar gam. Tá dúlgus mór bhána gam le déanamh inniuh agus sé sin I gceaddaíomh Galéir nachfuil muintear lom ó lomsa haar son clown I go bhlógra. Míle buchas a ghála de glán as ocht an sár íocht atá déantaige an leabharseo I scríomh agus a chuir an bód. Is rud anna bhór doing na Galéir. Beg sé gwing go jo, beg sé go der sé le gwinga. Ach freisin is tá sé go húntaach domsa mar bhúntóir nó mar iarmhúntóir, mar táim cleachtathe daoine óga teachún gach bliain ag déanamh taide don Teistamíochta agus inis beg gach rud le céile agam I leabhar amháin. So fiú an méid sin amháin de glán míle buchas. Tá is agam go nearna tú an chud taide, an chud teistil agus an chud ibre an obair. None of Peter DeLuca's grandchildren growing up knew him, so unlike Eileen, we couldn't ask any questions, and our grandmother never said very much and had little cautionary tale to tell about the one time that my grandmother did speak to me. And I imagine that a lot of other families were the same, that people did not speak about so-called troubles. But when I was in 5th class in school, the nuns decided that 5th and 6th class would take part in the upcoming IRA concert. Now, for those of my vintage, they will know that the IRA concert was a variety concert which took place in Kilkenny Theatre on Easter Monday night, hence the name, I presume. So our contribution was to be, the choir was to sing the chorus of the Mountains of Pomeroy for Breda Phelan, whom many of you will remember. We had to sing I See His Blood Upon the Rose and Let Me Carry You Across for Ireland, Lord, because we actually had a cousin of Thomas Ashes, who was in my class in school. But the highlight was a sketch about the wedding of Joseph Mary Plunkett and Grace Gifford, which took place in Kilmainham Jail the night before his execution. And I apologise to people who may have heard this story before. But the parts were allotted, and obviously the nuns in school didn't know about Peter DeLuca's history with the church authorities, because there were 2 religious parts in the play. Sheila DeLuca, who was in 6th class, got the part of Sister Francesca, who was Thomas MacDonough's sister, and who visited him in jail the night before the execution. And I got the part of Father Albert Bibby, a Kilkenny man, a Capuchin, who performed the wedding ceremony. The Capuchins were working in Kilmainham Jail. So I duly collected my soutane and surplice from the friary, belonged to some altar boy. Then went down and I told my grandmother that I was in this play and I was playing the part of Father Albert. And she said, oh yes, she said, I knew Joseph Mary Plunkett well, and he stayed in this house. And he slept in the room, which was then her bedroom, which is now my kitchen. And the next thing, the ominous words, and he wore gold earrings. So I went to school the next day, full of all this. I was just as good as this cousin of Thomas Ashes. And I said, my granny told me, and everything was fine until I said, and he wore gold earrings. And I got 6 slaps. And the whole incident was a tragedy. Not the 6 slaps, I was well used to those. But I never asked my grandmother anything again. And she didn't want to say anything, but she might have answered if I had asked. And really the message to any young people here is, now we were brought up really not to ask questions, but do ask them and keep asking them. And if they're not answered the first time, they might be answered another time, because it is important to listen and pass on information. Now the only other memory I had growing up, I knew that my grandparents met in Patrick Street Choir. Now my grandfather lived in Parliament Street, and there are 4 churches nearer to Parliament Street than Patrick Street, so I can imagine he just had one particular motive for going up to Patrick Street. But I always had this niggling feeling that he was some kind of a hoax or a fraud, because my grandparents had 6 children, and as far as I am aware, not one of them had a note of music. So I was delighted to open this book and discover that he actually was able to sing, and he used to sing solos, and his favourite song is mentioned twice in the book, and it's The Boys of Kilkenny. So maybe we'll all sing that before we finish. I'm not quite finished yet, I'm almost finished, you'll be glad to know. But it's a very appropriate song, because I think more than anything the De Lucrys loved Kilkenny. And it wasn't just Peter who loved Kilkenny. He had only one sister. She married a man from Gort, County Galway, and he said that before he got married, he hardly knew where Kilkenny was. But after he got married, he heard of Kilkenny every day of their married lives. So I think it's an appropriate song, because the last line is, of all towns in Ireland, Kilkenny for me. So before we sing the verse of the song, and you can all join for this, last 2 lines. The last 2 lines are the same, and you know the air, and I don't know, am I actually able to sing, but I'll try. But Sar a dhéananig mé sin, a ríis a deagláin, míle buíochas dit, as ucht na hibre seo, agus díobh se go léir, just tá 3 focail agam díobh se, an cé ceann ceannagaí, an dara ceann léagaí, agus an tríú ceann beidir an ceann is tátaí ná cuineagaí. So inis creep no way beidir le versa ó the Boys of Kilkenny, agus mátá sé ólas a gcuibh ábrigí ag freisin. Oh, the boys of Kilkenny are stout roving blades, and if ever they meet with the charming young maids, they kiss them and coax them and spend their money free. And of all towns in Ireland, Kilkenny for me. And of all towns in Ireland, Kilkenny for me. And don't let Mr. Dempsey know that we're singing about the town of Kilkenny, but city wouldn't stand.
I'd like to ask Alice Walsh, who was a great-granddaughter of Peter and Wynne, to make a presentation to Eileen Dunn for her kindness to us. Thank you. I just want to remind you that Declan will be signing copies of Peter's Key after this event. Refreshments will be available. We are closing with a 4-minute film that shows aspects of Peter and Wynne's life. The images show some of the first reports of the escape that appeared in the newspapers. Not all of them were correct. Thank you very much.